June 16, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Dressing room fights in both WWF and WCW. HBK threatens to quit, tons more. By Observer staff. Heat from fantasy feuds and storylines in this attempted shoot environment spilled out into real-life dressing room problems for both the WWF and WCW on June 9 involving four of the country's biggest name wrestlers, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Roddy Piper, and Kevin Nash. The end result were no serious injuries, but Michaels' future with the WWF is questionable. The problems in the WWF were more spectacular, with an incident that took place at approximate 7:20 p.m. in Michaels' dressing room resulting in both Hart and Michaels not appearing on the live show from Hartford, Connecticut that they were originally both supposed to play a prominent role in. The WCW incident took place after the conclusion of the Nitro show in Piper's dressing room when Nash came in to complain, blaming Piper for perhaps the single worst match thus far in 1997 when he and Scott Hall faced Piper and Ric Flair in the Boston main event before the largest crowd and gate in WCW history. All the problems had been brewing for a long time, in the case of Michaels and Hart, for well over 1 year, as has been well documented in these pages. Although skeptics could try and label both incidents, since they involved wrestlers who have bitter feuds in the storyline as promotions and wrestlers attempting to work the boys in doing angles for the hardcores a la the Brian Pillman-Kevin Sullivan angle, which in many ways changed the entire face of pro wrestling, and not necessarily for the better. In case of the WWF situation, that was absolutely not the case, and is more likely than not also not the case with the WCW situation. The problems between Hart and Michaels, bad seemingly forever based on professional jealousy based on who would be the top star and highest paid wrestler in the company and who would put the other over in their next meeting and if they ever would have a next meeting. Some of which has become ironic since in their personal battle, Steve Austin and probably Undertaker as well passed them both by when it comes to being the top star although not the highest paid. They got hot in recent weeks when Michaels believed that Hart stalled out a live interview on Raw to where the show went off the air before Michaels could do his superkick comeback, which was shown on tape later in the week. As revenge of sorts, Michaels said that Bret had been seeing sunny days on the next week's television show despite both Michaels and Hart supposedly having been told by management to quit doing insider references that the majority of the viewing audience doesn't understand. That remark, combined with a remark made months ago by Michaels on television saying that Bret professes to be a role model but he's seen him on the road, he's no role model, apparently caused friction in Bret's personal life to the point that Hart had been telling friends for weeks that he was going to at some point soon punch Michaels out. Nobody, including Michaels, would debate that should Hart have chosen to start a fight with Michaels that Michaels would come out of it unscathed. But a lot of people didn't believe he'd do it since Hart has the reputation for being such a professional, not to mention that with his knee in the shape it's in, this would be a foolish time for him to do so. Nevertheless, the rumors throughout the WWF locker room were that if Hart got the chance, he'd take a poke at Michaels. Apparently the problems escalated before the show on June 9 as both were meeting in long personal conversations with Vince McMahon, to the point that McMahon was having little time to converse with anyone else regarding details and attention to the ensuing live television show. Hart wound up going into Michaels' dressing room and the two began arguing. There were eyewitnesses to this which basically said they argued and started fighting, and it was rather quickly broken up. Most versions have it that Hart was screaming about how Michaels' comments affected his personal life, and he crossed the line and that Michaels was a smartass back. The two went at it, with most versions having it that Hart started it but that Michaels was every bit as guilty in precipitating it. It was believed to have been a one-sided short tussle which resulted in a few punches thrown and a large clump of Michaels' hair being pulled out of his head to the point it was described that Michaels was given a major bald spot. Michaels' face was all puffed up from the punches and he was bleeding from the elbow, apparently from being thrown on the floor. Hart apparently aggravated his recently repaired knee, but none of the injuries were serious. Agents Jerry Briscoe and Pat Patterson and some other wrestlers quickly broke it up with Hart on top of Michaels pounding on him, and Briscoe and Hart argued loudly back and forth in another room for a long time before Hart finally left the arena at about 8:30 p.m. without appearing on the television show. Michaels was blown up from the fight and a little worse for wear, but not injured to the point he couldn't have appeared on the television show. Michaels was scheduled to wrestle Brian Pillman in the television main event, doing the run-in after the Hart Foundation were all scheduled to jump Austin as he was coming down the aisle for the match. The Austin vs. Pillman match that had been hyped all week was cancelled because Austin injured his right knee, the good one, by landing wrong on it coming off the top rope during a spot in the previous night's match with Michaels. The knee was swollen badly to the point they decided to keep him out of the ring on June 9 although he was willing to gut out doing the match because they didn't want him being hurt any worse, and with all the other problems, add Austin to the list of guys who would be missing the upcoming weekend's major shows in Montreal and Toronto. Michaels was going crazy after the predicament and said that he would never work against anyone in the Hart Foundation because he couldn't trust them. He ended up walking out of the building claiming that he couldn't work or stay in this kind of an environment just before the show was scheduled to go on the air at 7:57 p.m. Other performers claim as he left the building that he was screaming about how he was quitting and that if he could make it to Boston, where Nitro was being done live, on time he'd just as soon go there. At that point the entire television show had to be scrapped and a new show put together literally minutes before it went on the air. The main changes involved doing 3 angles with Ken Shamrock to put him into the mix, as Shamrock will be put in Michaels' spot in the 10-man tag team main event at the next pay-per-view on July 6, the Canadian Stampede. Shamrock teams with Sid, Austin and the Legion of Doom against Bret, Owen, Davey Boy Smith, Jim Neidhart, and Pillman. Mankind was then made the replacement for Austin in Pillman's first major television match, but the match totally fell flat because there wasn't much to it. It was a major letdown with all the hype of Austin versus Pillman both on television all week and throughout the live television show, airing clips of the ankle-breaking angle, the breaking into Pillman's house angle, and Austin sticking Pillman's head in the toilet bowl the previous night. In addition, Mankind isn't over as a babyface at this point the way everyone expected he would be, and Pillman is limited in what he can do in the ring with his ankle still in tremendous pain. Exactly how this affects other scheduled matches is unclear, although almost all of Michaels' scheduled house show matches involved members of the Hart Foundation, including a first meeting with Bret in a triangle match scheduled for the June 28 head-to-head showdown in Anaheim/Los Angeles, which at press time, barring a reconciliation, will now be changed. If Michaels won't work with the Hart Foundation, it'll make it extremely difficult to use him in an effective manner since they are the lead heels, and his most natural program is with Bret. On the live show, Vince McMahon did address the situation, saying late in the show that both men had been sent home from the arena due to conduct unbecoming a professional. Jim Ross acknowledged the incident on the WWF hotline, calling it a fist fight and not going into any more details other than making it clear it was not an angle, that Michaels had walked out of the WWF, that he didn't know what the results of it would be but acted like he wasn't sure of the future of the WWF Tag Team Championship with Michaels and Austin as a team, and that a decision about it would be made this week. On June 10, McMahon sent an internal memo out to WWF executives saying, "Last night in Hartford, Shawn Michaels breached his contract by refusing to perform. We are hopeful Shawn will reconsider his position and return to work. Shawn has 4 years to go on his 5-year contract. The door is open for Shawn to return under the terms of his contract." By virtue of that memo, at press time it would have to be concluded that unless a reconciliation takes place, that for the time being Michaels won't be appearing on the house shows advertised or future television shows, but there are no official replacements matches aside from the change in Calgary since the incident had just taken place. What happens next should Michaels not return is a really tricky situation. If he doesn't perform, Michaels could and likely would be suspended without pay. The question becomes, can Titan theoretically, if things don't work out, suspend him for 4 years without pay? Would they continue to pay him his downside guarantee, believed to be close to $15,000 per week, for not working to keep them from breaching his contract and enabling him to go to WCW? Would they give him a limited release allowing him to work elsewhere in the world besides WCW, which is where he says he wants to go? Or could Michaels use the fight and other incidents in the past, such as when he was given a scare by the Harris brothers, who were on their way out at the time but eventually brought back, in the dressing room at Madison Square Garden, and try to claim an unsafe working environment as a way to claim he should be legally let out of his contract to go to WCW, where he claims he wants to be? Michaels and his father had a meeting at McMahon's request on May 18 to air out their problems, at which time Michaels told McMahon that he wanted out of his contract to go to WCW, and McMahon claimed Michaels told him that if he went to WCW, I could be set for life. McMahon refused to let him out of his contract. That statement about being set for life brings yet another question to mind, that of potential contractual interference by WCW, a charge that has been made whenever major stars under contract to either ECW or WWF have jumped to WCW, and has been claimed by WWF in the Curt Hennig case. Reports that Michaels had a clause in his contract that guaranteed him being the highest paid wrestler in the company turned out to not be true. However, Michaels has claimed he and McMahon had a verbal deal on such when he signed his contract. Since that time, Hart signed a far more lucrative 20-year deal with McMahon since he was the subject of a bidding war. Michaels also claimed to friends that McMahon told him that if he was ever unhappy in the WWF that he would be free to go. McMahon did make that promise to Ric Flair years ago and allowed Flair to return to WCW in 1993 despite having time left on his contract, but the situations were far different then as compared with now, and others close to the situation are skeptical of the latter story, if only because the whole reason McMahon has broken his long-standing business practices by signing every major wrestler in the company to guaranteed money long-term contracts is so he can keep them from going to WCW. On the WCW side, it was actually a worked match in the ring that precipitated the real problems. Flair and Piper were wrestling Hall and Nash in a non-title match. The early part of the match consisted of Flair and Hall brawling in one corner and Piper and Nash in the other. Nash claimed that Piper wasn't doing what they agreed on doing, although Nash also didn't appear to want to sell much for Piper. The match storyline was that Piper would work and sell the match, leading to Flair's hot tag. However, Piper looked horrible, and even with the star power, the match was killed and was well into the negative stars. Piper also called for the finish way early, about 6 minutes into a match scheduled for 12 minutes, which meant the post-match brawl to end the show literally lasted forever. After the show went off the air, it was Hogan and Savage, and not Hall and Nash, who remained in the ring to brawl with Flair and Piper, and for Flair and Piper to clean house on, and Piper ended up in the ring holding the WCW heavyweight, tag team and cruiserweight belts up in the air while Flair finished the fight. After the show, Nash went to Piper's private dressing room and knocked on the door, very hard apparently. There has been heat between finally Craig Malley, Piper's bodyguard, the guy who did the boxer gimmick in the famous Piper team skit, opened the door. Nash basically pie-faced Piper, which is throwing something of a palm blow and shoving him into the wall. Piper tried a kick to Nash's bad knee before Malley and Ric Flair, who was there with Piper, acted as the peacemakers and quickly broke it up before anything serious took place, but also leaving the heat between the two unresolved. According to two versions of the story, Nash and Malley did nearly go at it as well, but Malley, who is obviously much smaller, backed down. Most of the internal heat within WCW was on Piper for not doing what they had agreed to do in the ring and then calling for the finish early and making the show-ending brawl go so long it totally lost its focus as well. There have been problems with the Wolfpack and Flair and Piper stemming from the beginning of the hype for the six-man tag in Charlotte, where Flair and Piper didn't want Six in the match feeling he wasn't a big enough star, and where Kevin Green didn't want to turn on Flair as the company wanted. At one point the entire match was in jeopardy because Piper didn't want his team to lose, which was the original plan, and since he has creative control of his programs, asked to do a singles match with Six who he liked personally and thought he could prove he could still work and felt he needed to prove it to some of the wrestlers who saw him as someone existing totally off his past made name, by having a good match with him. The compromise was reached where the NWO team agreed to not only do the job, but not have Six do it because that would be the predictable finish, but instead have all three basically do the job at the same time to show that they were the more professional of the two teams. The company feeling in WCW seems to be that hopefully everyone will be professional and the match on the June 15th pay-per-view show won't be ruined. After that point, they'll all be programmed in a different direction and Piper will be feuding with Flair and kept apart from Hall and Nash so those problems in the ring regarding selling and the like won't be an issue. These incidents are just symptomatic of a much bigger problem in both of the major promotions. In their quest to be number one, and realizing that it's a star-driven industry in terms of drawing fans and television ratings, the stars have more power than ever before. They have power over their own programs to the point that they can and often don't do programs and finishes that would lead to drawing the most money or the best ratings because of egos. There have been so many live television interviews where guys have complained about behind-the-scenes things going on that the vast majority of the audience has no clue about rather than talked about their program and in all cases, with no disciplinary action. The stars are clearly above the rules, whether it be the drug policy in at least some, arguably most cases, or in many cases just overall professionalism, and we've seen time after time this year where focused programs and entire major shows have had to be revamped for reasons that have more to do with personal problems than late injuries. This is no secret within the industry and it's caused a cancer in both dressing rooms when the business is being run to appease a few people's egos or to maximize the power certain wrestlers have backstage rather than for maximum gain for all. Ironically, business is the strongest it's been in years as this is going on, so the argument can be made that this cancer has in ways been beneficial, but it has created situations where there are more injuries, both real and imagined, than ever before, and locker room tension that results in constant problems backstage involving the biggest stars in the industry. It's been suggested before, and both companies need to implement some sort of standards immediately to ensure things like this not necessarily don't happen again, because you can't do anything to ensure that, but if they do, that the parties who screw up live television shows or major shows for unprofessional behavior be disciplined in a serious manner. The reason this isn't done is because neither promotion wants to offend a top star who means something on top for fear they'll leave, or even worse, find a way to leave for the rival promotion. The ECW, WWF and USWA feud geared up this past weekend with incidents in all three promotions. The biggest angle, perhaps ever, in ECW took place on June 7th at the ECW Arena where Jerry Lawler debuted to a thunderous heel reaction. Lawler's crowd popped for his monologue, and where he, Sabu, and Rob Van Dam destroyed several ECW wrestlers with chair shots, was said to be perhaps the loudest in the history of the promotion, and certainly the loudest for any incident in the arena where a woman wasn't getting pile-driven, choke-slammed, or power-bombed by a man. That morning on USWA television, they officially announced that Tommy Dreamer had accepted Lawler's challenge and would face him on June 14th in Memphis. Dreamer did a taped interview where he said how Lawler had sold out the USWA, and said how he was a big fan of Memphis wrestling growing up and blamed Lawler's selling out on the reasons the promotion is in the state it's in, doing what was basically an approved shoot-style interview. Dreamer and Paul Heyman taped a second interview to air on the June 14th Memphis television show. Lawler, Van Dam, Dreamer and Heyman also appeared both on the live Raw is War show on June 9th in Hartford, Connecticut, and also did a second angle on the Shotgun Saturday Night show. The current plan is to continue this feud on Raw is War, although complete details haven't been worked out, to culminate in a match most likely at SummerSlam on August 3rd at the Continental Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Sources in ECW have said that the match would be at SummerSlam with Van Dam and Sabu versus Dreamer and Sandman, which is the same main event match Heyman is headlining most of his major shows, including the June 28th ECW Arena show with. Sources in the WWF say that it's better than 50% such a match will take place at SummerSlam, and it's tentatively penciled in for the show, but that it'll be Lawler and Van Dam as the tag team against Dreamer and Sandman or whomever Heyman picks to oppose them. Heyman has in the past expressed concern about using Sandman against Lawler, feeling that Sandman's style and Lawler's wouldn't work well together. It is also being considered having the match on the September 7th in Your House from Louisville, Kentucky rather than the Meadowlands, since Lawler's name would mean so much to be involved in a program for a match in that city. Both Sabu and the Sheik are claiming to be appearing on the June 23rd Raw is War show, which will be from Sheik's old stomping grounds, Detroit's Cobo Arena, to do an angle that would set up their involvement in SummerSlam. Paul Heyman claimed he knew nothing about that. The June 7th ECW Arena angle started after Dreamer finally pinned Raven in Raven's final ECW match, a double juice brawl that was said to be one of the best matches the two had ever had. The show, before a sellout 1,350 with a few hundred more turned away, was advertised on television as there being a major surprise appearance at the show. The lights went out, and when they came back on, Van Dam and Bill Alfonso were in the ring, destroyed Dreamer with a chair. The lights went out a second time, and when they came on, Sabu was in the ring helping them. The lights went out a third time, and when they came on, Lawler was in the ring. Lawler began talking over the house mic about ECW being extremely crappy wrestling and did some swearing and the like, and joined in destroying Dreamer with a chair. While this was all going on, Louis Piccoli was holding Beulah and forcing her to watch the carnage. The gangsters did a run-in, but they were destroyed by Sabu and Van Dam. Ditto Balls Mahoney. At one point Shane Douglas came out and fans expected he'd save the ECW side, but he got on the stage and said he had no problem with Sabu, Van Dam and Lawler and just watched it happen. WWF is said to be interested in using Douglas for his mic work as part of the feud. Heyman ran in after Lawler said he was the biggest piece of crap of all, and naturally he was destroyed. Sandman ran in and he was destroyed as well. Finally Taz came and everyone left, although Sabu wanted to go after him and he was held back by Van Dam and Lawler. The feeling among many is this may have been the best angle in the history of the promotion. Lawler is scheduled to wrestle Dreamer on the August 17th pay-per-view show, but Lawler will probably work ECW before that point as well. In Hartford 2 nights later on Raw, they showed about a 10-second clip of the angle, and Heyman and Dreamer, with his forearm taped to sell an injury from 2 days earlier, came down through the crowd to sit in the front row. They got a surprisingly huge reaction with ECW and Paul E. Chance, to the point they stole center stage and killed the Doug Furnace and Phil LaFon vs. Headbangers match that was going on in the ring. A few minutes later in the show, Van Dam beat Flash Funk in a fairly good short match. Heyman and Dreamer then hopped the guardrail and went after Lawler and Van Dam, largely with Lawler pummeling on Heyman and the other two going back and forth. Vince McMahon tried to sell it as if Heyman and Dreamer were in the wrong because they hopped the barricade and were there because they had bought a ticket as wrestling fans, almost as if he was reacting the way Heyman told him to react rather than how he normally would in such a situation. It was a good heated brawl, although that couldn't be said about the second angle. On the Shotgun show, the Headbangers were wrestling Lawler and Van Dam, which ended in a DQ when Dreamer attacked Lawler and Van Dam. This brawl lasted way too long and didn't get much heat, much of which will be edited off television and took place after the cameras had turned off. It was largely afterwards considered a mistake by all parties, particularly since they kept brawling for so long it held up the taping of the rest of the show. The Boston Nitro on June 9 broke all previous WCW attendance records, drawing a sellout 18,003 fans, of which 16,025 were paid with a total gate of $243,946. On television, Tony Schiavone on several occasions claimed the crowd was 22,000. The previous records were 17,331 fans and 15,834 paid, both set on January 20 in Chicago for Nitro. The company record gate was $224,660 spent on October 27 for the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view in Las Vegas with the Hulk Hogan vs. Randy Savage main event. It was part of the biggest money weekend in WCW history, as merchandise sales for Boston were $138,100, just shy of the record set on April 18 for the Nitro in Philadelphia, and a second major show was held on June 6 in Buffalo. The second annual Elio DiPaolo Memorial Show, honoring the former wrestler and restaurateur who was one of Buffalo's most famous citizens, drew 13,002 fans and $182,404, both also among the highest figures in company history, to the Marine Midland Arena. The bulk of that gate figure, roughly $100,000, will go directly to the Buffalo Children's Hospital and to the Elio DiPaolo Scholarship Fund. Merchandise hit $67,000. The records could be threatened, although most likely will fall just shy, with a June 16 Nitro from the United Center in Chicago. As of June 10, they had 12,553 tickets sold for $195,283. They had a stronger early advance than the January Nitro, which was a sellout well ahead of time, but it has since slowed down and they were about 4,000 tickets shy of capacity 6 days before the event. If they are all sold, would slightly top the Boston figures. If the records don't fall in Chicago, the next possible spot would be the August 6 Nitro from Auburn Hills, Michigan, which already has a $150,000 advance. Although Boston featured perhaps the worst match of the year, it was generally considered a star-studded, action-packed show with a strange reacting, generally hostile crowd. In a weird angle, Lex Luger did an interview early in the show saying the WCW Championship Committee was ordering Hulk Hogan to defend the title against him on the show because he hadn't defended it in so long. When Hogan came out with Eric Bischoff, to a huge babyface pop, they claimed they wouldn't defend the title. Apparently the story is that Luger simply screwed up the promo and was never supposed to say the committee said he was getting a title match that night. Luger wound up coming out and they did have a match, which was never explained as title or non-title, ending in 5:32 when Luger racked Hogan for the submission victory. The title was never acknowledged, although after the match Scott Hall, Kevin Nash and Syxx joined Hogan in destroying Luger and leaving him laying. On the television portion, which was actually only about 2 minutes, Hogan appeared to work harder and better than he had in a long time, although I was told the commercial period was all rest holds. It was the first time Hogan had done a submission job since December 1, 1981 in Nagoya, Japan for Antonio Inoki's Octopus. The show featured one out-of-the-ring brawl after another to the point that every angle looked exactly the same as the previous one, climaxing with the brawl that included nearly every wrestler on the card brawling in the ring, in the aisle, at the announcer's table, and climaxed with Sting showing up, hitting Nash with the baseball bat, and hooking up Diamond Dallas Page, and they both flew to the ceiling. Jeff Jarrett won the U.S. title from Dean Malenko in 14:06 by submission with the figure 4 after Eddie Guerrero interfered and gave Malenko a frog splash. The match was technically good but got little in the way of crowd reaction, as it was clearly a crowd that came to see star power and didn't care about the quality of the matches, with the exception of the Hall and Nash vs. Flair and Piper, which got the big pop coming out but was so bad it had no heat until the post-match, and the finish was heavily booed. The best actual wrestling was the TV opener, the 6-man, which saw the debut of Silver King, as he's jumped from EMLL to Promo Azteca, as he teamed with La Parka and Psicosis to lose to Ultimo Dragon and Juventud Guerrera and Super Calo in 7:45. The match wasn't as good as the Lucha Trios match 2 weeks earlier, and was sloppy in spots and didn't get as good a crowd reaction, but was still far and away the best match on either show, climaxing with some spectacular dives. The crowd didn't like it early and even chanted USA at the wrestlers, but about 5 minutes in, the series of dives out of the ring won the crowd over. In particular, Guerrero was the star doing a double springboard plancha, and they set up angles, which they haven't done in the past with the Lucha wrestlers, involving Parka, who got good pops basically doing Sabu chair spot dives, and Calo and Dragon and Psicosis. In the Monday night ratings battle, WCW's Nitro drew a 3.43 rating, 3.10 first hour, 3.75 seconds hour, and 6.00 share to Raw's 2.24 rating, 2.18 first hour, 2.30 seconds hour, and 3.80 share. The Nitro replay tied the all-time record with a 1.9 rating and 4.5 share. In the quarter-hour comparisons, Nitro opened with a lucha match at 2.4 as compared with Raw with LOD and Ahmed Johnson vs. Nation of Domination at 2.2, making it the weakest combined audience for a segment in months. WWF had no significant ratings movement until the fourth quarter hour, which saw Paul Heyman and Tommy Dreamer come to ringside, a Headbangers vs. Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon match, and a Lawler and Van Dam interview which fell to a 1.9. However, it got back to the 2.2 for an Austin interview in the beginning of Van Dam vs. Flash Funk, and jumped to a 2.6 for the conclusion of that match and the ECW Brawl plus Owen Hart vs. Sid. It dropped to 2.4 for the Mankind segment and fell to a miserable 2.0 for the final quarter hour with Bart Gunn vs. Rockabilly and Pillman vs. Mankind. WCW more than doubled the Raw audience again in the final quarter, doing a 4.3 for the star-laden Flair and Piper vs. Hall and Nash match and closing brawl. WCW ratings picked up significantly from the 2.4, even hitting 3.3 for Akira Hokuto vs. Malia Hasaka and 3.9 for the McMichael Green angle and the beginning of Luger Hogan, or more than double what WWF was doing, the 1.9, with Heyman, Dreamer, Headbangers vs. Furnas and LaFon and Lawler / Van Dam interview. Against the Austin interview, the Hogan-Luger finish and J.J. Dillon angle with Randy Savage and Diamond Dallas Page fell slightly to 3.7, and then the first half of Malenko vs. Jarrett fell to a 3.2 while WWF grew to a 2.6 with the Van Dam and Sid matches. However, Malenko-Jarrett finish grew to a 3.8 against the Mankind interviews 2.4. In Buffalo, some 22 former area wrestlers including Lou Thesz appeared at the show, which honored Buffalo Bills quarterback Jim Kelly, legendary boxer Carmen Basilio and local martial artist Gary Costanza. Kelly got involved in an angle later in the show as he came to ringside with Bills players Ted Washington and Reuben Brown and began arguing with Randy Savage. Savage took a bump for Kelly to a big pop before the match started, and the finish of the Savage vs. Page match ended up with Kelly distracting Savage, who appeared to have the match won, allowing Page to hit the Diamond Cutter finish. The main event on the show saw Hall and Nash retain the tag belts over Luger and the Giant via a dusty finish DQ after it appeared the belts had changed hands. The show opened with a Legends match as Tony Parisi and Gino Brito beat Dory Funk and Greg Valentine via DQ. Other former wrestlers at the show included Penny Banner, Dick Destroyer Bayer, Mario Frattaroli, Bull Johnson Jr., Reginald Love, Ida Mae Martinez, Angelo Mosca, Angelo Poffo, Pete Sacco, Handsome Johnny Barrett, George Scott, Bruce Swayze, Waldo Von Erich, Johnny Powers, Kurt Von Hess, Ernie Ladd and former area promoter Pedro Martinez. The World Wrestling Federation's 5th annual King of the Ring pay-per-view show had an interesting plot irony. Hunter Hearst Helmsley was scheduled to win the King of the Ring last year but, largely due to punishment from an incident in Madison Square Garden, wasn't even on the card, having been eliminated in a television preliminary tournament match. Fast forward to this year and Helmsley was eliminated in a television preliminary match, but due to an injury to Vader and several changes in plans, Helmsley was not only put back in the tournament, but given the crown on June 9 at the Providence Civic Center. King of the Ring would have to be described as a show that ended up being far better in actuality than it looked on paper. On paper, the tournament didn't look interesting and the only match on the show that appeared to be potentially memorable was Shawn Michaels vs. Steve Austin. Instead it was a solid, although unspectacular show. Initial plans were for Helmsley to be a first-round loser to Ahmed Johnson, as, in fact, he was in their Raw as War match on May 12 in Newark, Delaware. After a convoluted explanation necessitated by the injury to Vader making him unable to wrestle Crush on May 19 in Mobile, Helmsley was put back in the tournament and beat Crush to advance into the tournament. Based on television commercials taped weeks in advance, the final four in the original plans were to be Ahmed Johnson vs. Vader and Goldust vs. Savio Vega, so as it turned out, only Johnson of the originally planned final four were even there. Helmsley was scheduled to win the tournament last year to start his climb to major stardom, but the plans changed after Helmsley, Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Kevin Nash, and Razor Ramon Scott Hall got in the ring for their infamous curtain call in Hall and Nash's final appearance in the WWF before leaving for WCW. Since Hall and Nash were leaving and Michaels was a headliner and top draw that the company seemingly was afraid to discipline, which has led to a year-plus worth of future problems by not nipping the original problems in the bud, it was Helmsley whose fate was changed and punished. Not only did he not win at King of the Ring, But he basically spent the entire summer as a jobber before getting a chance to be rebuilt later in the year in the angle where Mr. Perfect was supposed to manage him and he'd get the rub from Perfect's star stature, which also, like most of the WWF's long-term plans, didn't materialize in the storyline the way it did when it was first scripted. The show drew 9,312 fans, paying $202,963 in the 16,000-seat arena, although Vince McMahon several times announced it as a capacity crowd on the air while Jim Ross, one crowd referenced during the broadcast, was a more realistic 10,000 fans. The show also did $74,672 in merchandise business. Headbangers Charles Warrington and Glenn Ruth defeated Bart Gunn, Mike Polchlepeek, and Jesse James, Brian James, in 6:10 when the Bangers did their combination powerbomb and leg drop off the top rope and Thrasher pinned Bart. James worked most of the way getting beaten on. Bart looked sloppy when he made the hot tag in to set up the finish. 1/4 of 1 star. Before the show they did an angle largely for the fans live to make sure everyone knew Mankind was the face in the match with Jerry Lawler. Mankind came out to mainly cheer since he was without Paul Bearer and cut a babyface promo, while Lawler appeared on the video screen and did a heel promo. The other interesting note of the pregame show was when they talked about the Michaels vs. Austin match. Michaels' name drew nearly all boos and Austin's nearly all cheers, which was quite a bit different than what took place when the match itself was in the ring. As the pregame went off the air, Bret Hart said that he'd be doing color commentary during Michaels-Austin, but that didn't happen either. 1. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, pinned Ahmed Johnson, Tony Norris, in 7:42 of the first King of the Ring semifinal. The crowd was incredibly hot for this match, but I think more because it was largely a hot crowd than for the two participants. Actually, the match was ultra slow paced and they did very little. Johnson pressed Helmsley over his head 3 times. Johnson was whipped into the ring steps. There was superheat for the comeback, where Johnson hit a scissors kick and a spinebuster, and set up the Pearl River plunge. Chyna got on the apron and Johnson went after her, allowing Helmsley to knee him from behind and hit the pedigree for the win. 1 star. 2. Mankind, Michael Foley, beat Jerry Lawler in 10:24 with the mandible claw. No Paul Bearer with Mankind again. Mankind did another interview to get over as a face. He's gone back to his Cactus Jack Bang trademark phrase, not that he's a face. Actually, this was not a good interview, made even worse by the lack of crowd reaction and the fact that was 10,000 in the building. The only person seemingly reacting was Vince McMahon, who was laughing at the humor that nobody seemed to either understand or think was funny. There were some cheers for Mankind as he came out, but almost no babyface pop or reaction to his interview. Lawler came out and insulted the fans and did a monologue with a lot of old jokes which seemed to make sure everyone knew who to cheer from. Jim Ross said that Lawler was discovered by Lance Russell when he was working as a DJ at a radio station and trained by Jackie Fargo. Lawler spent most of the match doing the shortcuts he's famous for, such as the work the fake foreign object gimmick. Lawler is one of the smartest workers around. The only problem is his actual performance consists of a 47-year-old man trying to do a Jerry Lawler gimmick. But he knew what he was doing, got heat, and carried the match. Mankind smashed his head on the steps when Lawler moved as he charged at him, which was a key spot because he was selling his neck the rest of the show. Lawler rammed him into the guardrail twice and gave him a piledriver outside the ring. Lawler even brought a dropkick out of retirement and hit a piledriver in the ring for a near fall. After a messed up neckbreaker spot, Lawler hit a fist drop and went for another piledriver, but Mankind powered out and hit the mandible claw for the win. 1 3/4 stars. Brian Pillman did an interview when Steve Austin snuck up from behind him and beat him up and put his head into a toilet bowl. However, it appeared the water level was so low that Pillman's head wasn't actually in the water. 3. Goldust Dustin Runnels pin Crush Bryan Adams in 9:56. This match killed the crowd. Ross brought up that the first King of the Ring was in 1986, which is actually the case, but a first in WWF history since they never acknowledged the pre-pay-per-view King of the Rings when they were an every so often event in the Providence/Boston market. Long nerve holds and chin locks. Crush is just awful. Basically he's Jim Duggan but without the charisma. D. LeBrown and Clarence Mason went after Marlena and Goldust punched D. Lobot was jumped by Crush to lead to the finish where Goldust hit a DDT for the pin. Dud. 4. Owen Hart and Jim Neidhart and Davey Boy Smith beat Psycho Sid, Sid Audi, and Legion of Doom, Mike Hegstrand and Joe Laurinaitis in 13:37. Owen did a good job here of carrying the match, but Neidhart and Hawk were pathetic and Sid was both good and bad, depending upon the spot. It took them 7 minutes of getting the faces over before they finally started the heat spot on Animal.
Obviously this wasn't done too well because when he finally made the hot tag to Hawk 5 minutes later, there was no crowd pop and Hawk was quickly cut off anyway. Sid got the hot tag, which did get a big pop, and set up doing a power bomb on Smith, but instead Hart came off the top rope with a sunset flip for the pin. The finish spot in this match, like Neidhart's selling, must have been miscommunication in that they misread the USA Network situation and thought it somehow applied to their work on Raw.
You know, sell the spot on a 7-second delay. 1 3/4 stars. 5. Helmsley pinned Mankind in 1926 to win the King of the Ring tournament. Mankind came out selling his neck injury. There was no heat at all for the first half of the match despite the fact that the work itself was solid. To the fans, at least until the two worked so hard enough to get the crowd into the match, they must have seen this as an unworthy final match. The second half of the match built to a very good match, mainly through Mankind taking crazy bump after crazy bump and the announcers attempting to paint a portrait of him putting on one of the most courageous performances in history. The match itself just didn't reach that level, however. There were even loud boring chants at times. Mankind hit a couple of hot shots for near falls. Helmsley took a flip into the buckles and later a backdrop on the concrete floor. Mankind did his elbow off the apron onto the concrete on Helmsley. Mankind hit the double-arm DDT but Chyna distracted the ref from counting the fall. Helmsley went for the pedigree but Mankind powered out. Mankind got the mandible claw on but Chyna pulled Mankind off Helmsley and out of the ring by the hair. Helmsley pulled off Mankind's mask, revealing why Cactus Jack, of course. Mankind got in and put the claw on again, but this time Helmsley broke it with fingers to the eyes. Mankind came back with a reverse atomic drop and did his running clothesline where both take the bump over the top rope. Mankind missed a falling elbow drive off the apron when Chyna pulled Helmsley out of the way, and Mankind hit his head on the guardrail. Helmsley whipped Mankind into the steps and gave him a pedigree through McMahon and Ross announcers' table. Chyna then broke the scepter they were going to use in the coronation on Mankind's back. Mankind even took his Nestia plunge bump off the apron where he cracks his head on the floor, although the effect of it was weakened because he actually crashed into photographer Tom Buchanan instead of the floor. Finally in the ring Helmsley finished him with the pedigree. After the match Helmsley destroyed Mankind with his crown so the gimmick seems to be King Hunter and Queen Chyna. Mankind crawled back to the dressing room on his hands and knees. 3 1/2 stars. Before Austin vs. Michaels, the entire Hart Foundation came to ringside. Brett did an interview talking about the July 6th pay-per-view from Calgary saying that they challenge any 5 wrestlers to face them in a 10-man tag, which at that point was scheduled to be Sid and Michaels and Austin and Legion of Doom. Pillman and Brett acted as if they were going to do commentary on the next match but were instead chased away by the agents. 6. Shawn Michaels, Michael Hickenbottom, and Steve Austin, Steve Williams, went to a double disqualification in 22-29. The surprise of this match is that Michaels actually got louder cheers than Austin, mainly because of the intense shrieks from female fans as Michaels was doing things. Austin was never booed, and Michaels was, but the cheers for him drowned out the boos in nearly every case. A mentally handicapped fan tried to hit the ring on Austin and Michaels actually dropped the match and helped him to the back. The way it was set up and ended up with so much attention being paid to it made it look like it was a spot designed to make sure Michaels wasn't booed heavily during the match. Both guys worked an excellent match, but it was marred by a lousy behind-the-times finish. Michaels in particular put on another show and Austin seemed to show no signs of a potential career-ending neck injury. Mainly it was Michaels' incredible bumps and athleticism that made the match. He crashed into the guard rail from the apron. He had his throat dropped on the guard rail. Austin whipped Michaels' chin first into the ring steps. He was press-slammed outside the ring and face first on the concrete. It appeared that one really stung because Michaels was shaking his elbow from that bump. Austin pulled Michaels' trunks down which got a huge female pop. Match ended with the first ref getting bumped. Michaels went for the super kick but Austin caught the foot and hit the Stone Cold Stunner. No ref to count the pin. Austin got up and got so mad at the groggy ref, Tim White, that he gave him the stunner. Michaels then superkicked Austin and had him pinned, but again no ref. A second ref came in, but instead of counting as Michaels had Austin pinned, he checked on the first ref. White finally got up and counted as Michaels had Austin pinned, but Austin kicked out. Michaels got so frustrated and not getting the pin when he had Austin down so long that he superkicked the second ref. Earl Heckner, a third ref, ran in and disqualified both men for attacking the first 2 refs. Austin tried to attack Michaels with his tag title belt from behind, but Michaels beat him to the punch. Fans chanted bullshit at the finish. The two eventually stopped fighting and started arguing and left together, yelling at each other all the way to the back. 4 stars. 7. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Farouk, Ron Simmons, to retain the WWF title in 1343. The Nation of Domination had a lot of presence when they started the gimmick. But they've lost a lot of steam through both overexposure, and because their television matches have cured thousands of insomnia, some of whom probably were watching to be entertained rather than put to sleep. It didn't appear that Farouk was taken seriously as a main event heel. That said, the two worked about as good a match as they could. It was a decent match with the outside shenanigans and storylines adding to it rather than distracting from it.
Undertaker even did the rope walk into a plancha outside the ring onto Savio Vega, Crush and D'Lo Brown. He did a second rope walk spot, but this time the Nation of Domination shook the ropes and he crotched himself. The other high spot of the match was outside the ring. Farouk took the ring steps, but Taker kicked the steps into Farouk's face. Farouk got a near fall with a piledriver. He came off the top rope with an attempted shoulder block, but Undertaker caught him in a power slam. Farouk used a power slam to knock Undertaker down. At this point outside the ring, the Nation of Domination began arguing with each other. Farouk was distracted, allowing Undertaker to come from behind with the tombstone for the pin. After the match, Undertaker gave the choke slam to both Savio Vega and Crush. Paul Bearer then told him to choke slam Farouk. He acted as if he didn't want to, but did it, and Bearer continued to order him to do it. He wound up doing it 4 times before Johnson came out. The two got nose to nose and Undertaker went to choke slam Johnson, but Johnson ducked out of the way and hit the Pearl River Plunge on Undertaker and walked out. 2 1/4 stars. All Japan and New Japan had a wrestling war of sorts with consecutive nights at Budokan Hall on June 5th and June 6th. From an attendance standpoint, All Japan, which traditionally runs its major shows in that building, won out. All Japan announced its crowd as a sellout 16,300 on June 6th. New Japan announced its crowd on June 5th at 14,000. Reports from people who attended both nights said that All Japan show was totally full, while New Japan was almost, but not completely full. All Japan, which always announces a sellout 16,300 at Budokan even though most of the time the crowds are closer to 14,000, ran its biggest singles match of the year on top with the annual Mitsuharu Misawa vs Toshiaki Kawada Budokan Hall Classic. Apparently this match lived up to that billing, as it was reported to us as the single best match of the year, with Misawa scoring a pin with a German suplex in 31-22 to retain the Triple Crown. Kawada destroyed Misawa with moves such as a powerbomb on the floor and a long stretch plum with Misawa getting to the ropes. Kawada dropped him on his head 4 times in a row, but Misawa got up and hit a desperation forearm. Misawa then used forearm after forearm to knock Kawada out, although he did a few dramatic kickouts before the German suplex finish. It was the 15th time the two had wrestled in singles matches during their careers, dating back to 1982. Misawa won the first 4 meetings in 1982 to 1983 when they were both undercard green wrestlers. They never met again in singles until October 21, 1992 at Budokan Hall, by which time Misawa was Triple Crown champion and made his first title defense by pinning Kawada in 29-52. All in all, Misawa has 10 wins and there have been 4 30-minute time limit draws. Kawada's lone win came as part of the triangle match in the Champion Carnival Finals on April 19 at Budokan Hall, which set up this match. New Japan had a deeper show, headlining with the return of Keiji Muto after the NWO angle in the United States, challenging Shinya Hashimoto for the IWGP Heavyweight title. The match was said to have been very good, although not nearly on the level of the match the next night. The big surprise is that Muto wrestled a total babyface style and Muto didn't act as if he was part of the NWO. The intrigue in how Muto would behave was one of the major selling points of the match. Apparently the storyline is that Keiji Muto is a New Japan babyface, but Great Muta is an NWO heel. Hashimoto ended up winning the match after 2 DDTs in 26:01. Also on the show was the finals of the top of the Super Junior tournament where El Samurai pinned Koji Kanemoto in 23:51. Kanemoto unmasked Samurai at 17 minutes and Samurai wrestled the remainder of the match with his face totally exposed. He won the match after hitting 3 reverse DDTs, slop drop, to capture his first ever junior tournament championship. In the other title match on the show, Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi retained the IWGP Tag Team titles, beating NWO Sting and Masahiro Chono in 14-15, when Kojima pinned Sting after a lariat. There were 3 other key matches on the show. The legendary Satoru Sayama vs. Kunyaki Kobayashi feud from 1982-1983 was revisited, with Sayama wrestling as Tiger King and winning with a cross-arm breaker in what was said to have been a so-so match.
An 8-man junior heavyweight tag team match saw Grand Naniwa and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Chris Jericho and Jushin Liger beat Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Yoshihiro Tajiri and Hanzo Nakajima and Shinjiro Otani in 13:45 when Liger pinned Takaiwa with an inside cradle as Takaiwa was doing his series of power bomb finishes. Cradled him after the fourth power bomb. The other interesting match saw Big Japan Tag Team Champions Takashi Ishikawa and Kengo Kimura, who won the tournament 2 days earlier to become the first champions, come out wearing the belts on a New Japan show and beat Riki Choshu and Osamu Kido when Kimura pinned Kido in 10:55. The Misawa Kawada match was more like a monster movie than a wrestling match in that both competitors continually rose from the dead time after time. At the finish, both men collapsed and were taken to the dressing room. The traditional end of a Budokan show is the presentation of the title belt and trophy to the winner after the match, but Misawa never came back out for the presentation to sell just how physically taxing the match was supposed to have been. The match aired on television, edited to fit into the 22 minutes television format, on June 8. The other important match on the All Japan show was the semifinal, where Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace and the Patriot beat Steve Williams and Gary Albright and the Lacrosse, real name Jim Roach. Kobashi and Ace and Patriot announced before the match their new team name at GET, which stands for Global, Energisch, Tough. The finish of this match came at 22 minutes when Williams was given a triple team powerbomb and pinned clean by Ace after a Cobra suplex. It was a huge surprise for the finish since Ace has never pinned Williams during his career and basically is another step in the attempt to position Ace at the same level as Williams and Stan Hansen when it comes to foreign stars. It's really surprising to see Patriot get this kind of a push because he has signed his multi-year WWF contract and is expected to debut toward the latter part of the summer, and it's believed his next All Japan tour, which ends July 25, will be his last tour with the company. Besides Patriot, both Sabu and Rob Van Dam have also quit All Japan, which actually led to a heated situation on the final night of the show. Sabu quit the promotion because he was mad about how he was positioned as an undercard wrestler who put over the top names when he was in the ring with them. The straw that broke the camel's back apparently was him having to put Giant Kimala 2 over on June 4th in Takasaka, and both Sabu and Van Dam quit that night, effective the end of the tour 2 days later. Sabu's lengthy All Japan deal wound up lasting all of 3 tours. Van Dam had been considering leaving for quite a while, so chose Sabu's leaving to be his time to leave as well. Despite Van Dam's stature in the US going way up based on ECW, and on the verge of going up even more with the WWF feud, his stature in Japan hasn't changed much since he started going to All Japan, and really never has done anything big with the group since his memorable junior heavyweight title match against Dan Crawford, Phil Law, Fawn. On this tour he put over PWF junior champion Yoshinari Ogawa in a singles title match. Due to Sabu's reputation from other groups in Japan, the promotion, which usually pays the wrestlers for the tour the afternoon of the Budokan show, refused to pay them until after Budokan, apparently trying to make sure they wouldn't no-show the big show. At this show they, even though it was their final show, were put over Yoshinari Ogawa and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi when Van Dam pinned Ogawa in 8:48. However, Sabu wasn't allowed to do any of his gimmick spots during the match, and apparently the wrestlers stationed around the ring were given orders to make sure the match went according to plans. This makes the 5th promotion that Sabu has left in Japan over the past few years, including both majors. It's expected that both Sabu and Van Dam will return to Japan as part of the ECW contingent when ECW makes deals to work with whatever promotion it ends up working with, which is expected at this point to be either WAR or FMW, with the belief being the former is the more likely. In an effort to save its sport from a political extinction, Semaphore Entertainment Group is expected to formally announce a series of rule changes within the UFC effective on the July 27 pay-per-view show. The official announcement should come within the next 2 weeks in an attempt to regain pay-per-view coverage by Request, TCI and Time Warner. The rule changes are designed to not change the basics of what the sport has grown to be. The rule changes include no attacking the fingers or toes, which nobody has done to date in the history of UFC, mandatory grappling gloves, no throat strikes, another thing that nobody has actually ever been able to do in a UFC match to date, no groin shots, which has been done a few times although not in a notable sense any time recently. No hair pulling, which really only came into effect in the Hoist Gracie vs. Chemo match in 1994, no elbows to the back of the head, no stomping and no pressure point striking, whatever that is supposed to mean. Most of these were rules designed to alleviate questions that state athletic commissions have had with UFC, because TCI said that if the states where the commissions won't approve UFC will change their viewpoints, that they would be happy to carry the shows. The political problem here is that the commissions aren't banning UFC for its potential danger but in most cases making a political statement to protect the powerful boxing interests that control the commissions in key states like New York, California, and Nevada. For example, the idea of pressure point striking comes from martial arts mythology of things like paralyzing and death blows that are what's known as voodoo martial arts, and not one blow of the type has ever been done in a UFC, and they don't occur in sports like karate, boxing, or kickboxing.
There was pressure additionally to ban knees, elbows and headbutts, but some of our entertainment group refused to acquiesce to those requests, feeling it would change the basic nature of what the sport is. John Peretti, who was the booker for the defunct Extreme Fighting promotion, has resurfaced once again, this time claiming to be in the process of inventing a new sport, without the political headaches.
The sport would basically be submission wrestling with no striking at all allowed, fought with 3 3-minute rounds, overtimes, a point system for takedowns and throws, 5 weight divisions and no draws. He's talking about debuting this sport on pay-per-view in October using players from judo, freestyle wrestling, shoot fighting and jiu-jitsu.
Realistically, this has no chance on pay-per-view.
Eliminating the striking should logically get rid of all governmental opposition, although logic has never played a part in these decisions. However, Americans aren't going to buy in any great numbers a combat sport that doesn't involve striking in some form to the face. Pancrase, which had open hand striking and kicking along with submissions, failed to make a dent. The death of famous game show host Dennis James, to cancer at the age of 79, saw wire service stories which ran around the country crediting him as the first television wrestling announcer. James did the commentary on one of the Dumont Network, the fourth television network, which went out of business in the mid-50s along with NBC, ABC and CBS during the infancy of American television, weekly wrestling shows, the Monday night primetime show from 9:30 to 11 p.m. starting in September of 1949 through March of 1952, emanating from Columbia Park in North Bergen, New Jersey. The Dumont Network's most popular wrestling show during that time frame originated from Chicago's Marigold Arena, with Jack Brickhouse announcing, airing on Saturday nights at 9:30 p.m. from 1949 to 1955.
Wrestling was a staple of network television primetime in the early days of television, similar to how it was in Japan through the mid-80s, with both NBC and CBS doing Tuesday night shows from New York. Then the most popular show of all was ABC's Wednesday night show, which lasted from 1948 to 1955. There were also regional wrestling television shows that predated the network shows.
However, James, who did variety shows and boxing broadcasts during the same time period, was easily the most popular of the wrestling announcers during its network run. While being popular with the fans, James was not at all liked among the wrestlers because his announcing was largely sarcastic, including quoting poetry in the middle of matches, and played it all off as a silly show.
When wrestlers would put submission holds on, James would twist a dog bone to make crackling sound effects and make fun of the holds.
While the wrestlers hated him making fun of their profession, the week after the first dog bone incident saw sponsors flocking to advertise of the wrestling show James announced on. James was also something of a heartthrob in his day and was more popular as a wrestling announcer with women fans than with the traditional men's audience. He also appeared as a wrestling announcer in several movies, including early 50s flick Mr. Universe, the late 70s movie The One and Only, which was set in the early 50s with a gorgeous George theme, and also did the wrestling segment with Hulk Hogan and Sylvester Stallone in Rocky III. Puerto Rico. Highlight of this past weekend was to be the climax of the Carlos Colon vs. Chiqui Star feud, with a loser must retire match on June 7th in Bayamon. This was set up when Star hit Colon with a gauntlet given to him by Victor the Bodyguard to win a stretcher match on May 31st in Ponce. They are having a tournament on television for the Universal title that Colon vacated a few weeks ago.
Mohamed Hussein beat Ray Gonzalez to win the Puerto Rican title on May 28 in Gurabo.
Butch Miller of the Sheepherders got a 1.5-inch gash on his forehead when his face hit the guardrail in Ponce. EMLL. They returned to Arena Mexico on June 6, headlined by Negro Casas and Ultimo Dragon, and La Fiera vs. Scorpio Jr. and Dr. Wagner Jr. and El Hijo del Santo. In the second fall, Dragon injured his shoulder and had to be taken from ringside by the doctors.
This made it 3-on-2 and the Rudos won the second fall to even things up. In the third fall, Dragon came back out as good as news and powerbombed Santo off the middle ropes to score a pin.
However, it was evident that this Dragon was larger than the original Dragon, and on television they showed the two side by side in a split screen, making it clear it wasn't the original.
Santo did an interview and said that it was Felino, who it was, that powerbombed him.
Santo also challenged Negro Casas to a mask versus hair match which they've been building up now for years.
The biggest thing here is going on behind the scenes where promoter Paco Alonso has had recent talks with both WWF and WCW regarding a talent hookup.
Alonso knows he needs to make a deal because his wrestlers are leaving for Promo Azteca because it's the connection to getting WCW contracts.
For WCW, making the deal with Alonso will cut down on Conan's internal power over the Mexicans in the company, and more importantly, largely eliminate WWF from getting major Mexican talent because it's readily acknowledged that nobody can deal with the disorganization of AAA.
Bischoff has talked with Alonso about ideas for promoting Mexico and even South America, and doing 2 to 3 Lucha Libre pay-per-view shows per year that would air both in the US and Mexico since Televisa and Turner Broadcasting are beginning a programming relationship having nothing to do with pro wrestling. Promo Azteca. The biggest news, as introduced on Nitro on June 9th, is that Silver King is the latest wrestler to jump here. In addition, AAA Minis Mascarada Sagrada Jr. and Mini Vader, formerly Espectrito, have jumped. Mascarada Jr. will take on the name Mini Rey Mysterio Jr. and form a tag team with the original Mascarada Sagrada and original Octagon Cheeto.
Mini Vader will go back to being Espectrito and team with his original partners Jurito Estrada and Piratita Morgan. There was a behind-the-scenes power struggle involving Conan and both Ricardo Reyes and his father, local promoter Raul Reyes, which Conan appears to have won, giving him more booking power.
As it turns out, Benjamin Moore's promoter's license in Tijuana wasn't revoked, although he was fined, and he ran a show on June 6th, but the only big names were Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Los Villanos, and it drew only 600. They are interested in using Dan Severn on the anniversary show in August. AAA.
The first Triple Mania took place on June 8th in Juarez, but we don't have any details as of yet on the show other than the main event was Latin Lover vs. Crazy 33 in a hair versus hair match inside a cage.
The other announced Triple Mania shows are June 13th in Tijuana at the Auditorio and June 15th at El Toreo in Naucalpan. In Tijuana, where AAA has been doing great business of late, the show was announced as Mini Mankind and Mini Goldust and Mini Vader, who likely won't be there, versus Mascarada Sagrada Jr., who won't be there, La Parquita and Octagon Cheeto, Luxor and Venom and Discovery and Frisbee versus Loco Valentino and Frank Nitti and Al Capone and Goyo. Mascara Sagrada Jr. and La Parca Jr. and Octagon versus Pentagon and Sangre Chicana and Fuerza Guerrera, Pierroth Jr. versus Cibernetico in a street fight, Crazy 33 and Picudo and Jerry Estrada and My Flowers versus Latin Lover and Heavy Metal and Pero Aguayo Jr. and Leon Negro, and main event is Pero Aguayo and Connect and Tinieblas Jr. versus Killer and Jake Roberts and Gorgeous George, Rob Kellum. El Toreo has Mini Mankind and Mini Goldust and Pentagon Cheeto versus Mini Cibernetico and Super Muñequito and Octagon Cheeto, Las Chivas Rayadas 1 and 2 and Venom versus Maniaco and Mosco de la Merced and Hysteria, Estrada and Crazy 33 and Picudo and Flowers versus Aguayo Jr. and Mexicano and Abismo Negro and Cranio, Killer and Pentagon and Scarecrow versus Blue Demon Jr. and Tinieblas Jr. A street fight with Heavy Metal versus Chicana, a cage match with the masks at stake with Payasos versus Parca Jr. and Sagrada Jr. and Super Muñeco and Aguayo and Octagon and Connect and Cibernetico versus Roberts and George and Cobarde Jr. and Fuerza Guerrera. All Japan.
With Giant Baba on vacation in Japan, nothing has been announced for the next tour other than the return of Hiroshi Hase.
Patriot apparently at some point during the tour tore his tricep, which was the injury that had kept him out of action for a few months earlier in the year.
June 8th TV show did a 3.5 rating.
New Japan. The June 8th show in Yasuda was a benefit show for the family of Hiromitsu Gombe, the former college champion wrestler who died in his first day of training in a dojo accident 3 years ago, which was the main reason Hiroshi Hase quit the company, since he was the one who recruited Gombe into pro wrestling.
At the show, Keiji Muto announced that the next tour would have the Great Muta, and not Keiji Muto, and then walked out of the building in mystery. Muta is booked as an NWO member on the next tour, which will include Dean Malenko, NWO Sting and Michael Wallstreet. The major show on the tour will be July 6th at the new Makomanai Ice Arena in Sapporo with Muta and Masahiro Chono. Chono's only match in Japan during that tour, as he'll mostly work July for WCW, versus Shinya Hashimoto and Riki Choshu, who is only working 2 dates this tour, Naoya Ogawa versus Kazuo Yamazaki, Jushin Liger defends the 7 remaining J-Crown belts against tournament winner El Samurai, Antonio Inoki and Tiger King vs Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita, Tatsumi Fujinami and Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi and Tadao Yasuda vs Wall Street and NWO Sting, and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito and Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto vs Malenko and Tatsuhito Takaiwa.
While this is not a definite, they are working on bringing Don Fry in to introduce him at the show but not wrestle.
Liger dropped the International Junior title, which was the War Company's belt and part of the 8-belt J-Crown, on the June 6 War Show at Korakuen Hall to Yuji Yasurioka in 22:42 after a double-arm DDT. No word on Liger defending any of the other belts as singular titles and breaking up the rest of the J-Crown. It was officially announced that Choshu would not defend his title at this year's G1 tournament from August 1 to August 3 at Sumo Hall. Last year it was a huge promotional success and big media deal when Choshu announced it would be his final G1 tournament. Kengo Kimura and Takashi Ishikawa won the Big Japan Promotions Tag Team titles on June 3 at Korakuen Hall, beating Shoji Nakamaki and Takashi Okano in the finals of the tournament to crown the first champions. That will probably heat up the interpromotional feud because after the match Shinya Kojika said he was going to resign as Big Japan president because his company's team failed to win the tag team tournament, although he was still acting as president and gave a speech in the ring at the big show 4 days later. Kimura and Ishikawa made their first title defense on the June 7 Big Japan show at Yokohama Bunka Gym, beating the New Japan team of Shiro Koshinaka and Akitoshi Saito when Ishikawa clamped the Sumopian Deathlock, a Scorpion Deathlock, but Ishikawa calls it the Sumopian Deathlock because he was a sumo wrestler in the 70s, on Saito. During the match Ishikawa hit Kimura with a clothesline by accident. As their hands were being raised, Kimura walked out on Ishikawa, said screamed "fuck you" really loud and walked out of the building without taking a shower. They're basically doing a Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels gimmick with Ishikawa and Kimura. May 31st TV show did a 3.4 rating. Other Japan notes. JWP's 20th anniversary Devil Masami show on June 8 at Yokohama Bunka Gym drew a reported 3,800 fans with several interpromotional matches, including an elimination match where Masami and Chigusa Nagio Gia and Meiko Satomura Gia and Tomoko Miyaguchi won 4 of 7 falls from Chikeo Nagashima, Gia and Sugar Sato Gia and Rieko Amano and Mayumi Ozaki in 38:53 when Nagio pinned Ozaki. Ozaki had pinned Masami to win the 6th fall, leaving her and Nagio as the final 2. Hikari Fukuoka retained her JWP title in the main event, beating Tomoko Kuzumi in 1821. Fukuoka has been on a lot of talk shows of late because her latest nude photo book was released this past week. Big Japan drew 2,340 in the same building, which had to be somewhat disappointing with all the New Japan talent on the show. Besides the Ishikawa and Kimura tag match, they had a no-rope barbed wire bomb glass match with Seiji Yamakawa and Shoji Nakamaki over Tarzan Goto and Mr. X, Jun Kikuzawa. A junior heavyweight match saw Liger and Samurai beat Yoshihiro Tajiri and Otani in 15:41. Mitsuya Nagai of Rings and Ryushi Yanagisawa of Pancrase both passed the test to join the All Japan Kickboxing Alliance, and Yanagisawa is debuting on July 25 and both may be groomed to appear on upcoming K1 Stadium shows. Yanagisawa said if he does well in his kickboxing debut that he'll leave Pancrase. Main event on the June 6 War Show in Korakuen Hall was the match where 140-pound company president Masatomo Takei was scheduled to wrestle, teaming with Genichiro Tenryu and Nobutaka Araya in a 3-on-2 against Tarzan Goto and Ryo Maike. Takei showed up wearing an expensive suit and tie and came to ringside, but Tenryu dropkicked his brother-in-law off the apron. When Takei got back on the apron, Tenryu gave him a hard chop and knocked him back to the floor, which he sold for the rest of the match. Tenryu and Araya ended up winning the match with no help from Takei, who never tagged in once. Akira Maeda is going to referee rather than wrestle on the ring's June 21 Ariake Coliseum show, which may indicate that much of the show will be shoot. The top 2 matches are definitely shoots, and another is yet unannounced match scheduled is Maurice Smith vs Yoshihisa Yamamoto, which is also a shoot. At the last show on May 25, Volkan had an interesting match with Joop Kasteel in that looked so tight it could have been a shoot. They were on their feet trading slaps, although Kasteel wasn't as aggressive as he usually is in shoots. When they finally went to the ground, Han immediately clamped on a submission and Kasteel tagged out, so it was totally unlike a worked Han match. Kiyoshi Tamura fought Russian Olympic freestyle wrestler in what was definitely a worked match. Tamura did a great job as usual in carrying a totally green guy to an entertaining match by selling for his suplexes and doing great transitions into submissions before winning with a knockout kick. Maurice Smith said that his dream match would be Frank Shamrock versus Tamura because they are the two most entertaining shoot-style wrestlers he's seen.
Shoichi Funaki, who is a Battle Arts wrestler but has been working lots of Michinoku over the past year plus, officially quit Battle Arts to become under contract to Michinoku. JD's Bison Kimura announced that her retirement match would be September 7th at Korakuen Hall, and said she wants to wrestle her original teacher, Jaguar Yokota. She'll also work August 3rd at Korakuen Hall teaming with Asia Kong for the final time against Kaoru Ito and Kuga. Main event on the Interpromotional Dream and Future Women's Show on July 19th in Yokohama featuring all the younger prelim women from the different offices will have the Gia Group's AW Junior Tag title with Satomura and Sonoko Kato versus Saya Endo, AJW, and Tomoko Miyaguchi, JWP. The other title matches are Toshie Uematsu defending the WCW Women's Cruiserweight title against Yoshiko Tamura, AJW, and Momoe Nakanishi defending the AJW Junior title against Sumiko Sake of JD. USWA. Besides Dreamer, Vince McMahon was also on this week's Memphis television show doing a heel interview claiming that Razor Ramon was nothing and a nobody before he made him Razor Ramon and that Diesel would finish him off. Dutch Mantel is now feuding with 69-year-old Gypsy Joe around the horn. Here and there. Bruno Sammartino, 61, was involved in an auto accident this past week which did $15,000 worth of damage to his Mercedes when he got sideswiped. Sammartino suffered injuries to his back, neck and shoulders, but he should recover well from all of them, although his doctor said that if he was in his other smaller car and got nailed the same way, he'd be lucky to be alive. Tony Rumble has a show on June 27th in Revere, Massachusetts with Abdullah the Butcher, Sergeant Slaughter, Demolition Axe, Tony Atlas, and Public Enemy. August Smile, the strongman/wrestler who lost to Masakatsu Funaki on a Pancrase pay-per-view show, quit the World's Strongest Man contest just before it was scheduled to start. He won it last year. He also has quit pro wrestling. All Pro Wrestling has a tournament for its title on June 20th in Hayward, California at the Pacific Coast Sports Gym. Here's one of the weirdest promotional swerve stories even in a weird business. Tom Cosati booked the Headbangers, Missy Hyatt, Scott Putski and Devon Storm for a tour of the Cayman Islands, but instead they were all taken to Aruba where there was no tour at all. Hyatt, Putski, Disco Inferno and Buddy Landell were all booked for indies in Pennsylvania on May 16th and May 17th through Cosati at the same time. Hyatt and Putski were told the Pennsylvania promoters knew of the tour and had found replacements. Disco and Landell were told the Pennsylvania shows were cancelled. Neither story was true, of course, and the Pennsylvania group had 4 key no-shows. NHB. Some added notes on the post-show party brawl after the May 30th UFC. The brawl, which was reported on in the June 1st Atlanta Journal-Constitution, started when Al Stanka, the 56-year-old trainer of Vitor Belfort, began mouthing off to Tank Abbott. Abbott took a poke at Stanka, which resulted in Valide Ismail, the 180-pound Brazilian who was in the February UFC losing to Yoshiki Takahashi, punching Abbott and sending him flying, which ended with the Abbott entourage and the Brazilians in a fight which included drinks being thrown and punches landing. Mark Coleman and promoters David Isaacs and Bob Merowitz broke the fight up along with about a dozen members of the local sheriff's department that were called. After the incident, according to the Atlanta newspaper report, Belfort told Merowitz that he should tear Abbott's contract up and not let him in UFC anymore because people like him give martial arts a bad name. The tentative card for the July 27th show in Birmingham under the Coleman vs. Maurice Smith main event are a heavyweight tournament with Carlos Barreto, Modi Hornstein, Mark Kerr and Kevin Jacob, and a light heavyweight tournament with Kevin Randleman, how he'll get under 200 without cutting off one of his arms in Beyond Me, Tito Ortiz, Ismail and Russian boxer Yuri Valun. Unless Randleman is weakened too much by dropping weight, he should be the favorite in his class and Barreto and Kerr would be an interesting heavyweight matchup. Again, you have a situation where the stars who highlighted the previous show like Belfort, Randy Couture and Guy Misger aren't on the next show. ECW Perry Saturn's knee injury was far worse than originally thought, although he still actually did limited working over the weekend. Not only did he tear the anterior cruciate ligament and the meniscus in his left knee, but also broke the kneecap and broke the tibia. He was scheduled to undergo major reconstructive surgery on June 10th and be out of action for at least 1 year, although Paul Heyman thinks he'll be back way sooner. Nevertheless, the Eliminators didn't drop the tag belts this week, as in Scranton on June 6th against the FBI, Saturn used a stone-cold stunner, and the next night against the Dudleys, he actually climbed to the top rope and dropped an elbow on his good side to win.
In the match last week in Trenton where the knee went out, he worked another 8 to 10 minutes on the broken leg, and although his moves were sloppy, he still did all his scheduled spots, blocking out the pain. Between the seriousness of that injury and the death of his son, he's had a most trying couple of weeks, and perhaps that's why Heyman chose to make him a hero and not drop the tag titles over the weekend as well.
For those wishing to send sympathy cards, you can write to him care of Don Label, P.O. Box 433, Ilion, New York 13357. ECW will start back on the Sunshine Network in Florida in a Friday 2 a.m. time slot at the end of June or first week of July, which means they'll be back running house shows in Florida. Dreamer needed 20 stitches in the back of his head from a stiff chair shot from Van Dam in the angle. A deal to send a half dozen or so wrestlers to the July 6th War Show at Sumo Hall will either be finalized or dropped within the next few days.
Notes from the June 7th show, which was said to be among the hottest in company history for angles, although not the best show for wrestling.
Shane Douglas kept the TV title, beating Chris Chetty in 6:52 in a match where Douglas gave Chetty enough offense that people believed there may be an upset. Pitbulls beat FBI.
Dudleys beat Sandman, and Balls Mahoney went Bubba pinned Balls to earn a title shot at Eliminators later in the show.
Terry Funk pinned Chris Condito in a disappointing match. Funk got very little crowd reaction and was physically hurting badly.
The crowd wasn't into the match and booed them when it was over.
It was really sad, according to everyone, to see this happen.
After the match, Stevie Richards did a promo talking about his neck injury and acting as if he may not be ever able to wrestle again. It was similar to the Shawn Michaels promo in February, and a lot of people didn't like it.
In fact, when Richards said he may never wrestle again, a lot of people cheered. Gangstas came out to issue a challenge for the tag team title and said that Paul Heyman had promised them he'd be on the next pay-per-view show. New Jack jumped out of the ring into the crowd during the promo at a heckling fan, although he didn't do anything once he got out there. When he got back in the ring, he cut a promo on the fan and challenged him to get in the ring. It was another example of an endless stream of reasons why promotions have these problems, because when guys screw up royally, as long as they're over, all the problems are ignored. Dreamer beat Raven to set up the big angle. Sabu pinned Taz with a finish that saw Sabu get the 3 count, but Taz choked him out after the match. Taz suplexed the refs around the ring and argued with Douglas, leading to an impromptu challenge where Taz agreed to leave ECW for 60 days if he couldn't make Douglas tap out in 3 minutes, provided Douglas would put the TV belt up. The match went 250 with Douglas tapping out to the choke and Taz getting the title. The original plan for this card was that Richards would lose to Funk, but then come back later in the show and win the TV title from Douglas. But with him injured, it gave Heyman a chance to have Taz do his first job since September of 1995 and be good for morale, since Heyman had told Sabu he'd eventually get the pay-per-view job back, but have people forget it because he won the title at the end of the show. Final match saw Eliminators beat Dudleys. Cronus worked the entire match largely 3-on-1 since Big Dick was around as well. At the finish, Saturn, broken leg and all, climbed to the top rope and dropped an elbow off the top on his good side and pinned Devon. WCW. Complete June 15th Bash Show is Hall and Nash vs. Flair and Piper for the tag titles. Page vs. Savage in a no DQ lights out match. Green vs. McMichael. Benoit vs. Meng death match. Steiners vs. Harlem Heat. Glacier vs. Wrath. Dragon vs. Psychosis. Morris vs. Conan, and Hokuto defending the women's title against Medusa, with Medusa putting her career on the line. It's not a lock Medusa will win that match, as there's been talk of her becoming a heel valet, but I'd figure the opposite. Other notes on Nitro saw Alex Wright beat Chris Jericho in 8:46 of a terrible match which saw the most heat come from the crowd bouncing around a giant beach ball. Wright as a heel worked like Michael Wall Street, and that's not a compliment, while Jericho was just off on everything. Akira Hokuto kept the women's title, beating Malia Hasaka in 1:43 with a Northern Lights bomb, and then gave her a second one until Medusa ran in and gave Hokuto 3 German suplexes. We were thankfully spared a Steve McMichael vs. Conan match, which was absolutely scary hearing the announcers say it was coming up next when Kevin Green attacked McMichael and they brawled all over the place while Hugh Morris cracked a broom over Conan's head. J.J. Dillon, who is packing on the poundage, said he was fining Randy Savage $50,000, and then Savage came out to attack him again, but Diamond Dallas Page made the save and they did yet another pull apart. Kevin Sullivan returned, and everyone was remarking about just how little of a pop he got in his hometown, where he was actually never a major headliner, as Kevin's early career was mainly in the Southeast like Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. Sullivan did a nonsensical face interview and challenged Benoit to come out, which he did. and Sullivan, Jacqueline, with no tease of a split anymore. Barbarian and Meng all destroyed Benoit.
Main event over the weekend did a 1.1 rating, while Saturday night, which started late because the Braves went into extra innings, only did a 1.8, its lowest in a long time.
Daily Variety had a short talking about Hogan's TV movie called Seal Warriors with Carl Weathers and Shannon Tweed. The story said TNT would like to do a 1-hour weekly version of the movie and pair it with a 1-hour pro wrestling show, which is just what the doctor ordered. Kimberly Falkenberg has a spot in the pay-per-view Tanda show called Best Built Babe Swimsuit Spectacular 2, airing throughout June on Action Pay-Per-View. She does 2 short interviews and poses in a one-piece and air clips of her from WCW. Barbarian put up a fuss last week about doing a submission job for Chris Benoit, but Terry Taylor insisted on it because they're trying to get the tap out over. For the most part, people throughout the company are being very complimentary as for the job Taylor is doing as booker.
Sullivan showed up on Nitro because it was Boston, which was a huge deal personally to him, but it's expected he'll be gone again for a few weeks before resurfacing.
Jushin Liger, Takashi Iizuka and 3 other New Japan wrestlers should be headed in. Other weekend house shows saw June 7th in Ogdensburg, New York draw $1,780 and $32,250, and June 8th in Glens Falls, New York drew $2,099 and $36,965. Ted DiBiase hasn't quit the promotion. He was in Edmonton over the weekend doing a Christian Athletic Conference deal and telling people that he'd be back in WCW as a babyface in an announcing role. The word came down from the top that Turner wants no more words like ass or damn used on the wrestling show. Kurt Hennig debuts on June 30th in Las Vegas, and he may be the mystery surprise, but they are working on a much bigger name from the real world, not a wrestler, as the surprise, but there are so many variables regarding that person that it may not happen, so there's always Hennig. Hogan is talking about canceling doing the movie he was going to do this summer in Montreal and concentrate on being at Nitro every week. WWF.
Pretty eventful Raw on June 9th from Hartford, Connecticut, before 7,164 paying $100,250.
Legion of Doom and Ahmed Johnson beat Farouk and Crush and Vega in 6:05 of about, much better than it sounds when the Nation of Domination had their problems and arguments, and finally Crush and Vega walked out, leaving Farouk to be pinned by Johnson. Helmsley did an interview where he said he'd have been king of the ring last year but blamed Vince McMahon's games and politics for holding him down.
I wonder if 1% of the audience had a clue what he was talking about. I was told that Michaels, after the deal went down earlier, went over this interview with Helmsley, so it was another example of promo having nothing to do with storyline. Mankind came out and asked for a rematch. Triple H hit him a few times with his crown and then Mankind put the crown on. Smith kept the European title going to a double countout with Goldust in 9:50 of a total dud match with a finish people booed. Really bad. After the match, Bulldog threatened Marlena and Goldust with a chair, but Shamrock did a run in saving them. Farouk did an interview where he fired everyone in the Nation of Domination except D'Lo Brown and challenged Undertaker and Johnson to a tag match for next week, where nearly everyone expects Johnson to turn on Undertaker and set up a title match for Calgary. Vega said he's going back to his Puerto Rican roots. They did 2 short segments to show tension between Sable and Mero, with Mero upset at the way Sable has been strutting around. Headbangers beat Furnace and La Fawn in 3:38. No heat at all except for chance of ECW, but Furnace and La Fawn wrestled real well. Van Dam beat Funk in a good short match. Sid powerbombed Owen in a bad short non-title match, which saw Shamrock do another run-in and belly-to-belly Neidhart on the floor as he kept interfering. Last part of Mankind interview with him putting the mandible claw on Jim Ross, but then stopping and showing all kinds of sympathy for Ross. Rockabilly beat Bart Gunn in 2:54 of a terrible match. Austin was attacked by the Hart Foundation to explain not wrestling Pillman. Mankind beat Pillman via DQ in a match with no heat, ending with the Hart Foundation run-in at 7:31. Austin and Shamrock did a run-in to save Mankind and cleared the ring, but then Austin hit the stunner on Shamrock just as the show went off the air. Good show, especially under the circumstances, but not translating into ratings. With Austin injured and Michaels walking out, the dark match main event ended up as Undertaker and Sid and Shamrock beating Bulldog and Owen and Neidhart in 10:16 when Shamrock made Neidhart submit. Diana Smith won the Mrs. Calgary Beauty Pageant on June 8. Weekend ratings saw Live Wire at 1.1 and Superstars at 1.6. A correction from last week. Steve Williams has not been talked with at all. WWF would be interested in him if he clears up his legal problems in a positive way, as they don't want the potential bad pub of bringing in someone who may go on trial or be convicted or was convicted of being caught with a pharmacy. They're back talking with Dan Severn about doing a program with Shamrock.
Paul Verlins has also been considered as a possible Shamrock foe. Speaking of Shamrock, his Lion's Den gym was open to the public in Lodi, California, a city near Sacramento and Stockton, on June 4.
Several of his fighters including Frank Shamrock, Vernon White, Jerry Bolander, Matt Rocca and Peter Williams will be training students in Lion's Den submission fighting. With NHB being uncertain and Pancrase not using any of his fighters except Guy Mesger, they need this avenue to keep the guys getting the new business going. They've also released instructional tapes which are unlike the kind of tapes I've seen on the market put out by the Gracies in that it's not trying to sell the name, legend and mystique, but basically meat and potatoes training and moves that are real and how to do them right.
Maurice Smith, Mesger and Trey Telligman were also at the grand opening. Mankind has verbally agreed to but not yet signed a 5-year renewal which would put him under contract until November 2002. Austin got a second opinion from a doctor who told him he could continue to work, regarding the neck injury, not the knee injury, and didn't need surgery but he'd probably be in a lot of pain and have to gut it out. His injury was diagnosed as severe erosion of his neck vertebrae.
WWF officials claim Great Sasuke was never offered a 1-year contract as he claimed in Japan, nor has he signed a 6-month contract, nor was he promised the light heavyweight title belt to come in.
However, it is 95% certain he'll be coming in for 6 months.
Sasuke had another press conference this week in Japan talking about wanting the WWF Junior Heavyweight title because the old WWF Junior Heavyweight belt was the historical foundation of the Junior Heavyweight division in Japanese wrestling from 1978 to 1983 when it gained popularity in New Japan, when New Japan and WWF were business partners under Tatsumi Fujinami and the original Tiger Mask. Nothing yet definite regarding a big November show in Japan with FMW.
Nothing at all to the idea of Atsushi Onita doing a bomb match in the US. Vader's court date in Kuwait over all those charges was June 10. He didn't have to go to Kuwait and his Kuwaiti lawyer was scheduled to plead his case for him. Tiger Ali Singh has been in Calgary with Shamrock training under Bret Hart and Leo Burke. Former Canadian football Glenn Kulka and Rodney Blackbeard, a big guy from Toronto, were also training with Hart and Burke and will be debuting as a tag team working for Emile Dupree in the Maritime provinces of Canada this summer.
Both have signed WWF contracts. The WWF's other trainee, former pro football Darren Drostoff is likely headed for USWA weekend house shows where June 6 in Lowell, Massachusetts, which drew $2,214 and $40,641 and June 7 in Portland, Maine, which drew $3,484 and $60,698. WWF put tickets on sale June 10 for its August 17 date at the Fleet Center in Boston but only sold 1,438 tickets the first day.
Sid was supposed to do a lot of media work in town but no-showed. Raw dates for July are July 7 in Edmonton, July 14 in San Antonio, July 21 in Halifax and July 28 in Pittsburgh plus August 4 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. John Tesh has an interesting contract demand. Whenever he does a concert, the promoters must give him a WWF action figure in the dressing room. Tesh said his tour director came up with the idea to make sure the promoters read every line of his contract. Tesh said that he's not a wrestling fan.
Toronto on June 14 has an advance of 12,700 tickets and $226,500 as of June 10.
Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228, June 16, 1997.